Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Toolbox Tuesday. My name is David Kilby, and I'm an Associate Regional Planner with SCAG's Housing and Economic Empowerment team. Today, we'll be discussing SCAG's Other Residential Toolkit, exploring the potential for adding new housing through land use conversions of underutilized non-residential sites across the SCAG region. I'll be joined by Jonathan Pacheco-Bell and Walter Simbab, South Bay City's SCAG, who'll be discussing the practical applications of the toolkit in their subregion. Studio 111 and Dudek served as consultants on this project, and its development also involved collaboration with students at USC's Full Price School of Public Policy. So just a couple of housekeeping items. The meeting length is about an hour and a half. This meeting is being recorded, and all participants will be muted during the presentation. At the end, there'll be a Q&A session, and if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the chat box, and we will log all questions, and a voice selection at the end of the presentation will be made. The recording of this webinar and PowerPoint slides will be available on SCAG's website, and we'll make sure to send a link out to everyone who registered for this session. So in terms of today's agenda, I'll provide an overview of the Other Residential Toolkit, get into the typologies, how we identified sites, discuss the toolkit structure, get into the toolbox of resources, and also present some successful case studies from the region. This will be then followed by a presentation from Jonathan Pacheco-Bell and Walter Simbab, both from South Bay City's COG, and they will be discussing the practical applications of the Other Residential Toolkit to cities and subregions. And we'll finish today's session with a Q&A. So jumping right into it, what is the Other Residential Toolkit? The toolkit is a resource guide that provides actionable guidance for the conversion of underutilized other sites to residential in the SCAG region. 4 typologies or land use categories were selected for this toolkit, and they're golf courses, gas stations, retail, commercial, and brownfields. These land uses were chosen due to changes in the market and consumer preferences that are affecting their long-term viability and usefulness. The toolkit provides direction for how to identify opportunities and barriers for residential conversion of these mentioned land uses, and it also offers best practices and implementable actions. So who is it for? The toolkit is intended to be used by agencies and policymakers, both in the SCAG region and throughout California in 2 different ways. The first is to spark interest and out-of-the-box thinking for jurisdictions who want to convert sites to residential but don't know where to begin in the process. And the second is for jurisdictions that already have a specific site in mind or even a specific typology in mind, but they just need some extra help to think creatively about how the site can be reused for housing. Like I said, the toolkit provides a step-by-step guide, complete with options and strategies for jurisdictions to remove regulatory and other barriers to the conversion of sites. Jurisdictions can read about the conversion success stories and reference a toolbox of measures to implement as policies and programs to initiate the site conversion process. So why is it needed? Well, as I'm sure many of you know, the mounting housing shortage in the SCAG region has created the need to find innovative ways to increase housing production and supply. While SCAG prioritizes infill and redevelopment of underutilized land based on the priorities outlined in the Connect SoCal plan, the built-out nature of Southern California communities are often a barrier to adding more housing. And this creates a challenge for many cities looking to achieve their regional housing needs assessment targets. So the toolkit is made up of the following components. We have the toolkit, which includes the step-by-step guide, a toolbox of resources, a site design lookbook that was created in collaboration with students at USC in a site planning class, as well as successful case studies from the region. We've also included an appendix that has a detailed research memo that dives into the typologies, what are some of the barriers, what are some of the challenges, how are they overcome, and also goes into some strategies. So it's quite a detailed research piece. We also have a Brownfields remediation memo that walks through the steps of how you go about remediating a brownfield site or how the cleanup process works, because this is a little bit more complicated than, say, a retail commercial site. We've also included a site inventory methodology document, which walks you through how to use SCAG's helper tool, which I'll be discussing a little bit later. And it helps you identify potential sites in the region that do have the potential to be suitable for conversion to residential. So what's the opportunity? So golf courses, gas stations, retail, commercial, and brownfields have great potential for conversion to residential, as each of these typologies is or will be experiencing market shifts and changes in demand of their use over time. So starting with golf courses, the continuous closure of golf courses nationwide has opened up the debate for new uses for them, chief among which has been housing. The generous size of golf courses offers a unique opportunity to develop impactful projects that help meet a city's housing goals. And this, as you can imagine, can be extremely useful for smaller jurisdictions that can accommodate a lot of their housing need on these large golf course sites. As large sites, golf courses also provide the opportunity for a phased redevelopment approach. The development doesn't happen to happen all at one go, but can be staggered or phased over multiple years. In addition, the 2019 Surplus Land Act permits the conversion of municipally owned golf courses to housing. So overall, the environment has been set to allow for golf courses to be converted to housing a little bit easier than in previous years. Next, we have gas stations. So according to the National Association of Convenience Stores, about 25% of the nation's 200,000 gas stations have closed since 1991. And this trend is likely to continue due to the rise of electric vehicles. Just this year, California agreed to ban the sale of any new gas-powered cars by 2035. The rise of ride-hailing and the future rise of autonomous vehicles will also have an impact on the number of gas stations that continue to operate. And lastly, competition from large corporations such as Costco have pushed out smaller independent gas station owners out of the market, and they make up about 60% of all gas stations. So as you can see, there is an opportunity that will only get bigger. There are over 8,000 gas stations in California currently, and as some of these go out of business, there's an opportunity to think about how to repurpose these former gas stations. Gas stations also often located in urban neighborhoods close to community services, on commercial corridors, as well as on key intersections in cities. So converting these sites will add infill residential density close to amenities and existing businesses. Gas stations do tend to be small, but they also tend to be adjacent to other auto uses that depend on them, such as body shops and car washes, which creates an opportunity for lot consolidation to allow for higher density mixed-use developments on these parcels. Next, we have retail commercial. As I'm sure many of you are aware, bricks and mortar retail is struggling due to the growth of e-commerce. And this has only been accelerated by the pandemic, which has led to a change in shopping habits. So in the future, there could be opportunities for conversion of these retail commercial sites to residential and mixed-use development. Retail commercial sites are sometimes located adjacent to transit, are generally highway accessible, or along major corridors. So from a transportation access standpoint, they're quite convenient for residential development. Also, existing zoning codes may already permit residential uses on commercial lots. Proposed laws such as SB 6 and AB 115 are two bills that would legalize housing and mixed-use development on commercial sites. SB 6 is called the Neighborhood Home Act, and this would facilitate new residential development on existing lots zoned for retail, commercial, or office use, while AB 115 would make it easier to convert commercial properties to housing, provided that housing includes a minimum percentage of affordable units. And our final land use category typology is brownfields. So brownfields are often infill sites in urban core areas, and redeveloping them provides opportunities to further the objectives of smart growth cities, such as close to transit, higher density, close to amenities. And brownfields are also often located in disadvantaged areas, and redeveloping them can lead to revitalization of these historically disadvantaged neighborhoods. The Brownfield Utilization Investment and Local Development Act Build also makes it easier for those that have purchased the brownfield site to avoid liability from previous contamination if they weren't responsible for it. And there are also a number of EPA-related grants for cleanup and remediation efforts. So the funding is there to help clean up these brownfield sites, which can add a significant cost for their redevelopment. I'm now going to describe how we use SCAG's helper tool to identify the potential conversion of sites in the region. The helper tool is an existing web-based mapping tool that we have here at SCAG, and it helps jurisdictions understand local land use and site opportunities. The tool is based on parcel-level land use data and other data sets that can be used to identify potential sites for conversion within a jurisdiction's boundaries. For our toolkit analysis, a large data set comprising the entire SCAG region was narrowed down to a subset of parcels best suited for conversion to residential by using a series of queries. The first query used was to identify the land use categories that we were interested in, which were the gas stations, brownfields, retail, commercial, and golf courses. So once we had done that, these parcels were then filtered based on ideal physical site conditions, such as a minimum parcel size of 1/4 of an acre, a slope of less than 6%. We also made sure that they weren't within any environmental hazard zones, such as fire hazard zones or flood zones. And lastly, our parcels were prioritized based on equity, access, and opportunity criteria, such as proximity to high quality transit, healthcare facilities, as well as grocery stores, and so on. So what did we find? So based on our queries, close to 56,000 acres in the SCAG region could be suitable for residential conversion. And I just want to note that the number is based on current land use categories, and these parcels will obviously still need to undergo steps such as updates to zoning regulations and the implementation of tools from our toolbox to become shovel ready for development. So this is really about just demonstrating what the potential opportunity is out there, not necessarily recommending that all these sites should be converted to residential. And also a thing to note is these numbers could change based on how many queries you use. So for example, if you use a different minimum site size, if you look for parcels that are further away from high quality transit, these numbers could change. But this is what we got based on our queries that we've included in our methodology memo. So the toolkit is structured or organized into 3 main parts. The first being the step-by-step guide that walks through the conversion of a site and includes identifying opportunities, analyzing the potential, identifying barriers, and selecting tools to overcome those barriers, and then finally pulling it all together in a conversion roadmap or strategy. And then we have a toolbox, which is a repository of various regulatory design and other types of tools jurisdictions can employ to overcome the barriers that they've identified. And finally, we have case studies and student examples to highlight success stories in the region and also provide design inspiration. So here, I just have an overview of the steps in the step-by-step guide. So if you will, we have the first step, or step 0, which is before you begin. And this is where you would identify and select a site typology to explore. So this would be selecting either gas stations, brownfields, retail, commercial, or golf courses, or you might want to decide to select multiple typologies. And then you then assess the site typology within your jurisdiction to reveal a set of sites that might be underutilized. So for example, if you had selected retail commercial, you'd be looking into whether there were a number of underutilized or vacant retail commercial lots in your jurisdiction. You then move on to step 2, which is a deep dive into the themes and evaluate the barriers and challenges that your selected site typology has. And then you go over to step 3 to identify the potential tools you can use to overcome that. And then finally, you bring it together in a conversion strategy or roadmap, which would highlight next steps in the conversion process. So I'm now going to walk through some of the steps in a little bit more detail. So like I said, step 0, or before you begin, would be to review each typology and a summary of the opportunities. Our toolkit does provide some opportunities and what they are, so you can read through those. You then identify what's most impactful to your jurisdiction. So for example, some jurisdictions might have more vacant gas stations, some may have more vacant retail commercial lots. So you want to pick the one that will give you the biggest bang for your buck. So once you've done that, you then proceed through steps 1 through 4 of the process. So step one in the toolkit would be analyzing the potential. And the first step we'll work through today is related to retail commercial. We'll use that as our example today. So some of the key questions you want to ask yourself include, do you have any retail centers with low tenancy rates or that have had high vacancies for several years? Are they vacant or underutilized retail centers located in transit adjacent areas or in specific plan areas that your jurisdiction has that have been focused on densification? Because if you do have underutilized retail commercial sites, in a specific plan area that has direction for densification, these would make great potential sites that could be converted to residential. And you want to ask yourself, is there any potential for smaller commercial sites in your jurisdiction to be consolidated into a larger development parcel? And are there any large retail centers, for example, that are overparked or have underutilized surface lots that can be redeveloped? We recommend the following departments should participate in this process, but of course this will vary per jurisdiction: planning, community development, economic development, as well as public works. So some of the possible outcomes of these steps could include an inventory of underutilized retail commercial sites, a map of specific underutilized opportunity areas, and our SCAG helper tool would be quite useful in creating these outcomes. And then the next step in the toolkit is to evaluate barriers. So this is where a lot of the work comes in. And barriers are categorized in different categories. So we have regulatory barriers. On the flip side, we have regulatory incentives. So the conversion of sites to residential or mixed-use development happens more often in jurisdictions that either have fewer regulatory barriers or discretionary approvals for residential use. So you want to consider if there are any regulatory barriers in your jurisdictions that may be preventing the conversion of commercial sites to residential and mixed use. So does the underlying commercial zoning for these opportunity sites allow for by right residential? If multifamily residential is permitted on these retail commercial sites, does it support compact development densities? So say around 30 dwelling units per acre. Are there any requirements in existing ordinances that limits the conversion of these retail commercial sites to residential? And then you want to evaluate your jurisdiction's regulatory incentives, because regulatory incentives that provide relief from onerous development standards and entitlement processes are often the catalysts that make redevelopment opportunities financially feasible. So you want to consider if your jurisdiction currently has any incentives that make residential development attractive overall. So for example, are there any parking reductions for residential developments as part of existing ordinances? Is density bonusing available? Is there a streamlined or expedited review process for residential developments or multifamily residential developments in your jurisdiction? So you would continue with your evaluation of the barriers and also start looking at things such as design guidelines, because retail commercial sites are often located in areas of transition between denser urban centers and low density residential. And higher density projects on these sites may require guidelines that respect and enhance the surrounding community context. So you want to consider if existing guidelines in your jurisdiction facilitate this kind of context-specific development. So questions you'd want to ask is, are they guidelines for buffering new residential development in commercial zones from adjacent nuisances? Are there urban design guidelines for development to respond to the scale of the surrounding context? And are they guidelines or best practices that you have in place that promote compact development on infill sites? You also want to consider the physical challenges of these retail commercial sites. For example, strip malls tend to be small and shallow, making residential projects on them challenging. And this is pretty common in commercial corridors where many sites are only 100 to 150 feet deep. So questions you want to ask yourself, are there several commercial sets that may be individually too small for, say, a multi-family residential development, but could be potentially consolidated with additional sites to have a large development parcel? Are small commercial sites in your jurisdiction unfavorable for residential development due to existing minimum requirements that you have? So may that be setbacks, parking, open space, and so on. And do you have any policies in place that can respond to some of these unfavorable conditions? In all of this, you also want to consider community involvement. So a community's desire to preserve local businesses or neighborhood destination coupled with obviously with the concern and scale and character of new development may present challenges. So you want to consider how community voices influence redevelopment in your jurisdiction. The questions you would ask is there community support for residential development along these retail commercial corridors? Is there a community engagement process to build support for these redevelopment sites? So do you have any outreach, any marketing, any information or educational sharing with the community? Does your jurisdiction have any community benefit agreements, or is community engagement even required as a part of a new development? So once you've done this, you then also evaluate your infrastructure needs. So the conversion of retail commercial sites to residential often requires upgrading of existing or building new infrastructure capacity. So planning for the conversion of sites area-wide or city-wide may even trigger a greater network investment. Say you have, a slew of sites that you want to redevelop along the corridor. This may trigger a bigger network investment that could impact other parts of your jurisdiction. So you want to consider if new infrastructure may need to be built for the conversion of these retail and commercial sites. And questions you want to ask yourself, at an organizational level is, have infrastructure needs for, the overall new residential capacity been assessed in district and corridors that may become opportunity areas of conversion of these retail commercial sites? And can incremental infrastructure improvements to support smaller sites be achieved through things such as development impact fees? Or perhaps you need to go larger than that and look to see if you have any special funding mechanisms in place like EIFDs to fund infrastructure investments. So now that you've looked at things from a jurisdictional perspective or agency perspective, you also want to be able to look at things from a developer's perspective. So long entitlement processes and delays that lead to additional costs is a big deterrent for developers. So you want to consider if you have any measures in place to reduce the entitlements for developers in the approval process. So for example, are developers required to provide offsite improvements or amenities that may increase permitting times? Either clear guidelines for development and lieu fees? And are developers required to coordinate individually with other agencies such as Caltrans, or does your jurisdiction have one point person that coordinates all this on their behalf? And really germane to all of this is development interest, because if there's no development interest, then you can't really convert these retail commercial sites to residential. So the conversion of existing retail commercial sites to residential is more challenging in a market where there's low interest or attractiveness for new residential mixed-use developments. So some of the things you want to ask yourself is, do you currently have a database of opportunity sites to market to potential development partners? Is there, for example, a TOD or affordable housing incentive to complement existing state law that could provide additional benefits to create new market demand for residential conversion? So these are the kind of questions you want to ask yourself in step 2 when you're evaluating the barriers. So the next step in the process is identifying tools to overcome them. So here in this table, I just briefly summarize some tools in the toolkit. They're organized into 9 categories. So removing regulatory barriers, incentivizing residential infill, minimizing physical challenges, promoting good urban design, reducing development risk, facilitating community involvement, and generating development interest, and finally funding new infrastructure and brownfields remediation, which is a category in its own, because again, the remediation at brownfields is a little bit more complex. So the toolkit has a number of these tool matrices that highlights all the tools you can use. So for each tool in the toolbox, we discuss the agency role. So if the agency is facilitating the tool or is an initiator or partner of the tool. We also describe, what the tool is, what it's applied to. So there's a key here. So for example, you would indicate that this is applicable to all land use types, whereas GS would imply that it's applicable to only golf, gas stations, and so forth. So I'll now walk you through an example of a tool. So here we have a category 1 tool, which is remove regulatory barriers. Examples of these kind of tools can include a general plan amendment along with the zoning amendment ordinance, or another kind of tool could be a specific plan, area plan, or corridor plan. The jurisdiction would have a facilitator role. The scale and scope of this tool would be institutional change and new regulation. And you'd use this tool when you'd want to change the underlying zoning for individual sites or, many sites in in the area that you identify. And then we also provide background description on what the general plan amendment would do, and also outline steps about how you begin that process in your jurisdiction. And then here we have another example of a category 5 tool, which is reduced development risk. And again, examples of these are program EIR, streamlined and new fees, district-wide traffic impact studies, pollution insurance, and so forth. And for the streamlined and new fees, again, this would be applicable to all kinds of land use categories. Again, the agency role would be a facilitator. The scale and scope would be a new regulation, and you use this kind of tool to make redevelopment sites more attractive by reducing uncertainty for the developers. And we've also included a step-by-step process within the tool, which would guide you through how you go about creating it and implementing it. So in this case, you would take a broad review of your overall infrastructure fee structures. You'd identify key administrative bottlenecks that may slow down or confuse the process. You create a set of proposals to streamline your process, and this may include changes to how and where the fees are collected. And finally, you'd adopt these streamlining proposals and implement them. Our toolkit also includes sample policy language that you can adopt to your jurisdiction. So for example, we have sample policy language you could use to change parking standards to reflect infill. You can also have sample language to create incentives for small parcel development. So there's a slew of these sample policy language templates within the toolkit that you can use and adapt to your jurisdiction if you need a starting point, and even if you want to understand what kind of language to use or how to phrase it. And then the final step in the step-by-step guide is creating a conversion roadmap. So we do this by clustering tools together that address the barriers and challenges and identify policy and programs and processes that you can use to overcome them. For example, here we have the conversion of a commercial strip mall, and this may require a zoning change and a general plan update that addresses the regulatory barriers. It may require urban design standards to address some of the barriers related to design guidelines. And it could also involve streamlining or mitigation to do with uncertainty for developer risk. And then in terms of addressing any community engagement challenges, you might want to institute a community engagement plan or a community benefits agreement. And all this roadmaps will change based on your specific project and the combination of tools you use to overcome the barriers that you identified. So in terms of implementing the roadmap, like any project, you'd identify key champions within the agency to move forward. You'd assign responsibility for tasks to each new department, create a schedule, and clear milestones. And you would also identify and acquire funding for staff time, grants, and other expenses for the program formulation. And this is especially true for more complicated conversions, for example, related to brownfields that have contamination. And obviously, you want to set measurable goals and identify desired outcomes and metrics just to keep your project on track. Because like anything, if you start the conversion process in year 1 and you only finish it in year 6, due to things such as inflation, the cost of delivering that housing can increase significantly during that period of time. So you don't want this to be a very long, drawn-out process if it can be avoided. And now I'd like to discuss our collaboration with academia to develop the design lookbook. So we collaborated with students at USC in the site, in Elizabeth Valletta's site planning class, to create a design lookbook to inspire you all to imagine what kind of housing can be achieved on former golf courses, gas stations, commercial retail, and brownfield sites. So 9 case study sites were selected, representing all 6 SCAG counties. The sites represented typical typologies that are common to the region, and we also selected sites that were within low, medium, and high density contexts. So there are 9 case studies in total in the toolkit. So here we have an example by a student named Stephanie Wong. So this is an example of a conversion of a big box retail site adjacent to a single family neighborhood. And the proposed conversion is to a mixed-use residential development. And some of the key issues that Stephanie grappled with included compatibility of high-density residential to the existing land use, a site that fronts busy arterials on two sides, the loss of existing retail commercial business that was in the original development, and also the neighborhood context, such as heightened scale transitions. And the potential design solution she came up with was having ground floor retail facing the arterial streets, multi-family residential courtyard, and multi-residential courtyard buildings facing the arterial as well, and a structured parking podium that was shared between both buildings. She also suggested having a public promenade with green space and ground floor townhomes opening up to the green space and also fronting the less busy side streets. And she also included details such as stepping the massing back, which creates an appropriate sense of scale for this open space and the transition to the ground floor townhomes. So like I said, we have a number of these kind of examples in the toolkit that respond to challenges that you may face in your jurisdiction, because like I said, these sites were selected and are very representative of typical site characteristics in the SCAG region. And we also have some real case study examples that are local to the region. So this was a conversion of a failed strip mall to a mixed-use development with dedicated affordable senior housing in West Hollywood. As you can see, here is the before, and then we have the after. So some of the tools they used included a general plan use amendment, a zoning amendment, and a specific plan creation to address some of the regulatory barriers that they had with this development. They had a robust community outreach process, as well as an advisory board that made recommendations, and they retained existing legacy businesses, which addressed some of the challenges to do with the community, because the Trader Joe's was really valued by the community. So when the building was redeveloped, the Trader Joe's went back into the new development. And then in terms of generating redevelopment interest, they were able to find funding for the senior affordable housing portion of this to support the developer when they were redeveloping the site. And here just are some of the site characteristics. So it was 3 acres. The zoning was community commercial. The development program included a 7-story mixed-use building, 294 market rate units, 76 senior affordable housing units, and 32,000 square feet of retail. So we have another case study from Pasadena, and this is called Lincoln at Orange Grove. So this one's really interesting because it was an abandoned gas station, and an adjacent parcel sites were consolidated together to create a mixed-use development with affordable for sale and rental housing. So again, we had a list of the conversion tools that they made use of. So they had a specific plan to address the regulatory barriers. They had incentivized residential infill by being really flexible in terms of satisfying the inclusionary housing. They allowed for lot consolidation. In terms of reducing development risk, this project actually had pollution insurance. So that way, if for example, there were impacts due to the contamination from, the former underground storage tanks for the gas, there was insurance for that. And in terms of generating redevelopment interest, they were able to tap into their affordable housing funding to support some of the affordable units. And then just in terms of the development program, the site was 1.25 acres, so not that large. The zoning permitted mixed use with residential by right. It was a 4-story development. And then in terms of unit count, it included 22 low income, 13 moderate, and 11 workforce housing, and just over 6,000 square feet of retail. So I just want to wrap up by saying that new housing facilitated by the Untitled Residential Toolkit should be obviously placed intentionally in locations that would further SCAG's Connect SoCal goal for sustainable development. and also align with the three fundamental smart growth principles, which are compact cities and sustainable development. So locating housing on infill sites next to transit and amenities where possible, creating land use patterns that promote healthy communities and economic security. And there should also be a focus on equity in decision-making and development outcomes. So one thing we noticed in a lot of the case studies we saw was that existing community needs, by not displacing what is already successful, leads to an easier conversion process. So if possible, integrate what is valued by the community back into the development, especially when you're dealing with retail commercial sites or sites that may have a place that's valued by the community. And obviously, you want to consider housing affordability and the diversity of options. So integrating the various types of housing at varying affordability levels, not only to address market demand, but the gaps in the housing market and housing supply. I'd now like to turn it over to Jonathan Pacheco-Bell from South Bay Cities, who will discuss how the toolkit can be applied on a practical level to jurisdictions and subregions.
Thank you, David. Thank you to our interpreters, and also thank you to everybody for being with us today. I'm Jonathan Pacheco-Bell, Senior Project Manager for Land Use and Housing at the South Bay Cities Council of Governments in Los Angeles County. We are a joint powers authority comprised of 16 cities as well as the LA County unincorporated areas that share the goal of maximizing quality of life and productivity in the South Bay. We were formed in 1994 to give a voice to our subregion. Our subregion is a unique place. We have diverse demographics and diverse geographies. So for example, we have beach and coastal cities like Manhattan Beach, inland cities like Inglewood and Carson, peninsula cities like Rancho Palos Verdes and Rolling Hills Estates, as well as the San Pedro and Wilmington communities near the Port of Los Angeles. We have ethnic, cultural, linguistic, and socioeconomic diversity across our urban, suburban, and rural areas, comprising about 1 million people. And like many of us on the call today, South Bay cities are working on accelerating affordable housing to meet those RHNA goals. Now, this work is happening in our subregion that is not known for high density, nor a large public transit mode share. In fact, before COVID, our public transit mode share was about 3%. South Bay cities also reflect a post-war suburban development pattern. So think strip malls, regional malls, big box retail, office parks, and so forth. Even before, but especially after COVID closures, consumers have been shifting to e-commerce and work from home arrangements. And with that, one of the things that we've seen is South Bay commercial areas have become underutilized. Meanwhile, our cities are challenged to identify suitable parcels to support housing production required by the 6-cycle RHNA. So as David mentioned earlier, these are very built out cities. Ours are built out cities needing creative land use approaches. So in the South Bay, housing additions are going to require redevelopment. This brings us to our housing acceleration efforts funded by Regional Early Action Planning Grants, or REAP grants. Today, I'll be talking about, with my colleague Walter Simbab, practical applications of the Other to Residential Toolkit. And it's going to relate to our commercial redevelopment into housing REAP project. There's some really great overlap with the toolkit and our project. Our REAP project identifies strip arterials, regional malls, office buildings, industrial parks, any underperforming commercial segments for potential redevelopment into housing. The participating cities are Carson, El Segundo, Hawthorne, Hermosa Beach, Manhattan Beach, and Redondo Beach. As part of our REAP project, we're using the OTR toolkit essentially as a beta test. And incidentally, we share the same consultant. We're working with Studio 111, as well as Dudek and Cosmont companies on our REAP project, and Studio 111 developed the toolkit. So there's some really nice synergy and overlap between these two REAP projects. The typologies in the toolkit are some of the same that we're looking at in our commercial redevelopment program. The process that's laid out in the toolkit is something that we're looking at doing so we can help our cities identify sites to meet the RHNA targets. The tools provided in the OTR toolkit are what we're using for our REAP project to coordinate housing redevelopment into what we call complete neighborhoods. And that's something that our research director, Walter Simbab, is going to be talking about. So as the sub-regional COG, we see the potential in using the OTR toolkit to help all South Bay cities find sites so they can meet those essential RENA targets. With that, I'd like to introduce my colleague and research director at the South Bay Cities COG, Walter Simbab. He will be coming up next to discuss the practical application of the OTR toolkit in the context of our sustainable housing strategy. Wally?
Hi, thanks, Jonathan, and hello, everyone. Good afternoon. First, I want to congratulate David. That was quite a mouthful. That was an amazing walking through that tool in about 35 minutes of straight talking is no easy task. So I want to encourage all of you to go look at the publication that David was talking from, because it's really amazing. It's beautifully done. It's just the graphics are, I mean, it's really an attractive thing. You want to keep it on your bookshelf, even if you don't read it. It's really great looking. So we're going to talk about what we're doing in the South Bay Cities COG with the tool. And as Jonathan alluded, we have mentioned we have retained through the REAP funding. We turned in the REAP application about a year ago, before we knew there was such a tool, and it ended up through the competition. We ended up retaining the same team that did it, plus Cosmont, to do some additional economics. So I'm going to talk about two things. One is that the cities use this sort of tactically, and the COG uses it strategically. So, of course, cities have to satisfy their RENA mandates. And in our case, we've got 34,000 cities that were dwelling units we're supposed to add or plan for the next 8 years, cycle 6. This is significant. I mean, these numbers have changed for every subregion and so forth, but it's significant because that number represents about 80% of every housing, all housing development in the South Bay since 1990. So there's also a calculation that I don't know that many folks do. I learned this from a colleague in Santa Monica. If you're going to use density bonuses to get that affordable category that houses the affordable category, and in our case, we have 21,000 for cycle 6. That adds market rate housing that goes above and beyond what the market rate housing is mandated in RENA. So applying the same factor that happened in the South Bay in cycle 5 to cycle 6, we will actually end up with 90,000 new dwelling units in order to get the 21,000 that are going to be affordable. So Jonathan, go on. Oh, so the point, all right. So the fact is, if they're all built in single family neighborhoods, this is going to seriously change the character of the South Bay. So we're obviously looking for some alternatives. And so we're looking at commercial parcels. As I said, we started doing this years ago, but when the REAP program came out, we used the funding for REAP to get the consulting help to help us. So we've got almost 11,000 commercial parcels, 7,760 acres of commercial property. And as we've said, there's this REAP study underway. In a sort of a way, we should come back in a year when the study is done, because we're sort of being a beta test for that tool without actually using the tool, because the consultants are doing it for us. And we're only focusing on the redevelopment of commercial strips, and we're not looking at gas stations and golf courses and that sort of thing. What we threw into the scope of work was an additional component, which was take a look at which of these sites might be amenable to being next to a commercial cluster, so that we could start working on our complete neighborhood strategy. So Jonathan, go ahead. So here's a map of the commercial properties in the South Bay. And of course, they're mostly on the major arterials, as you can well imagine. And go to the next one, Jonathan. And this is a completely lousy map, and I apologize. This should have been overlaid on the map of where the commercial development is. But anyway, we didn't get our GIS guy to do it. So there it is. Those are the 6 cities that Jonathan mentioned. They're the beach cities plus Hawthorne plus Carson, and I'm missing something, Hawthorne. Okay, go on, Jonathan. So if we were doing this through like graphically, this is where it shows the size of the big red ball is where the concentration of industrial property by city, where the commercial properties are. And Jonathan, next one. Here's a bar chart that shows by city where they are. Torrance is the biggest city, so of course it would have more retail commercial property than the rest of them. But you can see that the smaller the city, and some of them are bedroom communities, and they don't have all that much commercial property. But still, there's something everywhere, even up on the Palos Verdes Peninsula. Okay, Jonathan, next one. So our next step with the toolkit is actually to, like I said, we're not rigorously applying the toolkit because we've got the consulting team that did the toolkit working with us, and they're excellent. I mean, absolutely wonderful to work with. And so we'll next summer, I think, Jonathan, I'm not sure when we're done. Is it next summer? I think it is. We'll sit down and look at the lessons learned from the application for the consultants versus what the toolkit would do. Maybe, because we are a beta test, so it might tweak it a little bit. And then we would go on and meet with the rest of the cities because we've got 6 in and 9 out. And that would mean that based on the results we have, any of the other 9, particularly Torrance, which is not in the study, might be very interested in using the tool. And as well as the original 6, because look, this is a dynamic process on the ground. Things will change. They might want to take another look at it. So to summarize, what the city's going to do are looking for opportunity sites. And what we're going to do is take a look at which of those sites would have strategic value. Jonathan, go on. So we do a lot of our mission has to do with transportation planning. And so every one of those new residents will need a mobility service of some sort. And so if we're looking at the basic initial rate of allocation, we're looking at about 70,000 vehicles being added to the streets. If we're using the one that's what we're going to get if we have density bonuses, it'll be around 180,000. So that's a pretty big jump in vehicles, about 2.3 per household, which is the average. It's been that average for a while. So all of that's going to increase congestion. It's going to add pollution, greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, we expect some of them to be electric vehicles, which means we'll have to have new charging infrastructure for that volume of vehicles. And also we have to be concerned that will put stress on the electric grid. Now, all of this is in the context of international, national, state, county, city imperatives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by roughly 50% by 2030. We're going to have to manage electricity demand because I'm sure many of you have been reading that the hydroelectric system is reaching dead pool along the Colorado River, and we may lose hydroelectric in 3 years. And of course, there's increasing climate events like heat that also has to be factored into what we do with the built environment. So go ahead, Jonathan. So with all of that in mind, we started thinking a number of years ago about a strategy that would try to develop complete neighborhoods. Complete neighborhoods are, simply put, where you bring as many destinations as you can into the neighborhood so that they're within a half a mile, if possible, so that people can walk, take cycles or, cycle or in our case, also do any kind of micro-mobility, which is a golf cart or a e-bike or a e-scooter. Seated e-scooters are coming out. So what we would do is take a look at, we're adding another layer of this with our consulting team to say, okay, here are the candidate sites that are tactical. These are opportunity sites. Which of them are most amenable to turning this, to using that as being part of a complete community, complete neighborhood? So the way we're looking at it is creating a whole network of neighborhood centers or neighborhood business districts that have to be dense concentrations of destinations because we're trying to bring as many destinations into the neighborhood as possible. And we also have some academic research that was done for us that said, the way you get walking is through density, destinations per acre. And there would be a virtual presence as well as the physical presence, which leads to the internet access facility that we're trying to develop. We've got a proposal out to do 3 of them in a pilot study that we're calling digital hubs, for lack of a better term. And all of that supported by a mobility hub, which would be a place where you could connect with zero emission multi-mobility options, as well as especially micro-mobility. So back in the day when we were conceiving of the complete neighborhoods, we were looking at, this is a concept drawing, and it's along the arterials, we have all these destinations arrayed, most money of them retail, some of them are commercial office and so forth. And so what our thought was, Jonathan, go to the next slide, was to concentrate them in centers at the big intersections, the major intersections, they're a mile apart, and then replace what was there with housing. And that's where we would get the housing. That was the concept. Of course, the real world doesn't work exactly that way for reasons that are explained in the toolkit. But nevertheless, this is a drawing of what we're trying. So go ahead, Jonathan. So if you look at another concept or a schematic, it gives us a set of neighborhood centers that are a mile apart, and each of them with a kind of immediate catchment area of a half a mile, but also ability to go between each of them with a bike or with, I mean, that's the walking radius, but using a bike or a golf cart or something, you could go to many of them within 3 miles. Go ahead, Jonathan. And so this depicts kind of the capture rate of each one of these centers. And like the one within walking distance, you would get a capture rate of 50% of all trips taken by the neighbors in that neighborhood. Now, this is not aspirational. This is actually an empirical finding. All this started about 15 years ago with a study of 8 neighborhoods and their mix, their density, and surveys that asked folks where they went, how often they went, and how did they get there. So we literally had our two best performing centers captured 50% of all of the trips within a half a mile, and half of those trips were walked. And therein came the Russian analysis that said, hey, density, destinations per acre makes a difference. And you can see that the drop off, the friction of distance drops off as you get further away, but even at 10% in 2 to 3 miles, you could still get there with a golf cart or something like that. Okay, next one, Jonathan. So we have, I've learned this from my friends in transit-oriented development. What you want is some great pictures of what you're talking about. And so we put together this hypothetical neighborhood center if you were starting from scratch, which of course would take a lot of money to do that, but still in all, this is what we came up with. And it was actually based on a real intersection, which I think is 182nd and Prairie. And there's a gas station on one corner and a mini mall on another and a larger sort of mall on another one. So with the artist, we worked and put this down here. And we think we went from 19 businesses now to something like 85 or 90 businesses in this reconfiguration to make it density per acre. Okay, go ahead. So just to remind everybody, footprints can really change and they've been shrinking. There is in fact a trend in the retail world that's moving from big boxes down to really small, particularly for urban centers, but this would be a suburban center. And 2,000 square foot or smaller is what we would be looking for any of the tenants of this center. Or if we're rehabbing something that's already there, we would still be looking to have many more destinations per acre. Go ahead, Jonathan. So here it is. This is a typical building, and there's 7 stalls there for some sort of destination, some sort of business. Go ahead. And this is with 18. This is just an example of how you might divvy up the floor space to get that. Go ahead, Jonathan. So that's basically the physical part of it. Now I'm finish off here with some enhancements that we're talking about. One's a digital hub, the other one's a mobility hub. The digital hub, basically, digital inclusion right now is a really hot topic, and the federal and state governments literally putting billions of dollars into digital inclusion infrastructure, and particularly focusing on seniors and low-income folks. That we would have anyway. That's part of the mission of our digital hubs. We have to have a transition from wheels to wires if we're going to make the carbon reduction targets. And so this is absolutely important to have a place where you can, in fact, connect to the wires at high speed with all kinds of technology to help you. Speaking to economic development, particularly small business, neighborhood renewal, because if it's in the middle of an existing neighborhood, it should have some sort of spillover effect, attract visitors and help other failing retail nearby. And of course, a place to get cool in the heat. Part of the resilience issue. This is again one of those real swell drawings of imagination of how this might look like in the future. This is a 3D printer doing bicycle printing in the foreground. Go ahead. And this is our South Bay Fiber Network, which I assume some of you have heard about. It is actually on the ground in practice. It's a ring network with laterals that connect out to. It's a middle mile network, so it's connecting to 15 civic centers, as well as a half dozen or 8 or 9 anchor institutions, including 6 sites of the South Bay Workforce Investment Board. And so any place we wanted to put one of our centers where we're putting housing to make a complete neighborhood, we can build off of this basic backbone network and get there. Next one. And this is the digital highway. I mentioned micromobility, walking, cycling, and then all of these electric devices, and they're all in the market, and they're all relatively cheap compared to a full speed $35,000 to $50,000 to $75,000 full speed electric vehicle. And because trips are short, you don't really need a big battery device. You can get by with some of these things. Go ahead. And this is what we're doing to try to encourage this. We're changing the infrastructure a little. On the left is the map. All the green are the slow speed streets in the South Bay. And what we've done on the right is designated 10% of them to be the local travel network, which is designed and on slow speed streets and sharrows to accommodate anything that goes less than 20. So that's how we want to use the tool strategically. We want to help cities not only find opportunity sites, but figure out how we can make them into complete streets or into complete neighborhoods. So happy to take any questions.
Any questions from folks today on how we're looking into using the OTR toolkit? Donald asks, are the South Bay cities also looking at expanding and incorporating mass transit into the 15-minute city?
We don't have control of that. Jackie, if she's on the line, could speak to that. We have some muni operators. We don't really have any connection. We're just now getting sort of the north part of the South Bay. We're not rich in rail transit, and I don't think, Jackie, if you're there, you can speak to it.
I am here.
Okay.
I'm Jackie Backrack. I'm the executive director, and we do have a proposal for the Green Line, or the Sea Line, I guess, to come into the South Bay. It would only have 2 stops, and it wouldn't be coming until at least 2030 at the earliest, probably later than that. Other than that, Metro has pretty much identified where they're spending their money for the next 30 years, and they're really not spending it in the South Bay. So we have a minimal bus service. No one comes to the South Bay to and sells a car, and that's why we're looking at other innovations such as the local travel network. We're just trying to be realistic with the resources we've got. Thank you.
That's actually a good segue. Miguel asks, what change constitutes turning roads to the local travel network from their existing conditions?
Nothing. We turn them into sharrows with and put up some signage. In fact, we're working right now with Farron Pierce to design a graphic look for the local travel network. The cities are in charge of implementing it, and we're working with them now on the design, and it would be sharrows. What we're trying to do is divert, of course, traffic from the major arterials onto slower speed streets. And part of the design of this was to make sure it's interesting, of course, that most of the major destinations are on the large arterials. So how do we get into the back of them? We're trying not to have, this is not complete streets. And I think that's an important thing to be aware of, is we're talking about something that's that doesn't mix speeds on streets. It tries to divert the slow traffic to its own sort of roadway. And we're doing it through sharrows and signage and stuff. Jack, do you want to?
I was going to say that what we found out, we did a pilot project with neighborhood electric vehicles. And when people realized there were slow vehicles, even the cars went slower. So although we're going to have, the cars will have the ability to go down these streets because we're not taking any lanes away, they will know that this is a street where there will be more slow speed vehicles, and we'll have the signage so that they drive slower and the vehicles will be safer. We think this worked with our pilot, and we're going to try it now. There was another question about families. What we're doing is we're trying to make available a lot of the accessories on these neighborhood vehicles. We actually had a pilot with neighborhood electric vehicles, which are the nicer golf cart kind of vehicles, and families absolutely loved it. I mean, they used it to take their children to school, to go to doctor's appointments, after school appointments, and we have more and more of these getting purchased in the South Bay because they're slow, they're fun, and they get you where you need to go if you're just doing your errands. So we think this is a family. This is a family network that will not just be for adults, but will be for everybody.
Yeah, and let me add that I didn't go into it because we didn't have much time, but we've done like 18 years of research and demonstration around these ideas. And the neighborhood electric vehicle that Jackie was talking about was one of them. And we found that people were very happy driving them, that they were just excited about seeing their neighborhood at slow speed. And one of the things we found out is we tracked everybody's usage with GPS on every vehicle in the household. And that 70% of the trips are under 3 miles. And so partly what we're trying to do is get funding. We've got to deal with UC Davis, where we're going to roll out if we can get the funding for them, but they're ready to go. We would roll out a drive what you need, because most people don't understand what their actual mobility demands are. So they all want big cars, and in fact, now 70% are going 3 miles, and 90% are going less than 10 miles, which is still in the range of not maybe necessarily an e-scooter, but certainly in the range of a neighborhood electric vehicle. And I would add, we also did a full speed battery electric pilot after that. And truthfully, the level of approval was higher with the NEVs than it was with the full speed battery electrics, because I think of the price. And again, everybody, a golf cart looks like a golf cart, or an NEV looks like a golf cart, and you have different expectations. One of the things we found out is that no one knows what they actually need. And when it looks different, they're kind of more happy with it, and rather than get into a very expensive full speed car that they don't need.
I see the next question is, what types of safeguards or tactics are being used to avoid displacing disadvantaged communities, long-term and short-term?
Well, that's a great question, because that's one of the benefits of this, the access facility, the digital hub, is that it's there as a resource for the people in that community to make money. It's access to the digital economy with all of the tools and the support that would go with it. And so, anything from base level stuff about you could go and print 3D jewelry and sell it, to you can sell services, you can get trained in CAD and CAM. I mean, it is a very powerful facility, which we have prototypes of. I did in the mid-90s in Compton. So no one should be displaced because the rising tide should lift all boats. That's the theory. I mean, one does it to make sure, to understand these things. But I mean,
another thing I would add to that is that the way we're envisioning the development of the digital hub, the neighborhood broadband centers, is moving it into a nonprofit model, right? Where we have not just one, but we have a network of of neighborhood broadband centers, digital hubs that are nonprofits that are part of a ring that have boards that are comprised of community members, right? Every nonprofit has a board, and we can have community members sitting on those boards, much like what we see with Trust South LA, the land trust that does housing advocacy, and community members are part of their boards. So that is another way where we can build in safeguards where you actually have the residents of the community, the longtime residents, as part of the leadership to make sure that it is being done in a way that benefits the folks who've been there for ages. David, any questions or follow-ups on your end?
Yeah, I mean, just one of the things the toolkit does recommend in looking to is community benefit agreements. So when, new developments are going in place, having the community at the table and having community benefit in place. So, you hold the developers' feet to the fire if they do, make promises on certain things or whatnot. You have that agreement in place so cities can follow up with them. And then also things such as, rent control. They're definitely kind of, ordinances that prevent evictions and so forth. So there are definitely things you can do in the long and short term to avoid, displacing disadvantaged communities, especially for certain types of, land use categories, such as the brownfields, which are at times located in disadvantaged neighborhoods. And when redevelopment comes there, revitalization comes there, there is obviously the fear of gentrification and what that means for the surrounding neighborhoods. So, thinking ahead of time and having those kind of community benefit agreements in place can be quite helpful. And also, like that, if anyone has any questions, also feel free to use the raise hand function if you want to rather ask it than type it out.
I see a question. Do you see the tactical hubs working in smaller scales or cash-strapped areas? I think we're talking about the digital hubs.
Yeah, well, the prototype I developed in Compton in 1995 was in the Martin Luther King Transit Center, and it was like 2,000 or 3,000 square foot. It was a very small scale. It was at the transit stop, and it was at the time an attempt to show what happens when you wrap public telecommunications around public transportation. The same idea is going forward with only transit would be mobility as a service would be part of the mobility hub, and that would include public transit, but also this entire new range of Ubers and Lyfts and car sharing and ride sharing and all kind of stuff. So it started at a small scale, and the question is, we'd like to scale it up. And we've hopefully going to get funding to plan 3 of these. We are in for the so-called ladder grants, which are coming out of the PUC to do around the digital divide issues, planning for these facilities that Jonathan is referring to with on the ground, boots on the ground, kind of working with people individually to try to get exactly what they need. The other thing is, it's not a normal technology center in the sense of, there's not a lot, but there's many of those around. I mean, Best Buy is doing something in South Central. This is different in that it would include more advanced programs, and it would also serve the mobility function or the access function by bringing in distance education and telemedicine and things like that. That would be virtual presence of the destinations that many of the people in the neighborhood are interested in going to. And that's what I demonstrated before in the 90s. It works. And given the horrible outcomes of the COVID pandemic, we learned that the wires access and the services that can be run in virtually are very, very important.
And for that ladder grant that we've submitted, we're looking at disadvantaged communities. So we're looking
Yeah,
at,
they gotta be disadvantaged communities, right?
right, in the South Bay. So Carson, Hawthorne, Gardena, and unincorporated West Athens, Westmont.
So the big deal there is we have the South Bay Fiber Network. I mean, there are very few subregions that have their own broadband network that we can control where it goes and pricing and so forth like that. So that's kind of a big deal to build off of.
And I wanted to bring it back to the OTR toolkit to emphasize the importance of having all this knowledge in one resource. And it's still a lot of knowledge that our cities may not have the capacity to engage. I would imagine that several of our colleagues here on the call today are also dealing with this. We have a lot of short staffing in our cities. Our planning departments have vacancies. It's hard to fill. People have left before, during, and after COVID, and they have very little capacity to do a lot of the long range planning and policy level and real deep forward thinking work. That's where we come in, and what we're envisioning is taking the OTR toolkit and distilling it even further, so that we can help our cities maybe even making a smaller version of it, a much more lean version, and tailor to the South Bay, so that they could work with their limited capacity and still get the essentials of the toolkit and work with it. And if nothing else, we always have the fallback of the original deliverable that Studio 111 put together.
Yeah, and bear in mind, this also has all to do with housing we're adding. I mean, anywhere from what 38,000 to 90,000 new houses, and you just can't drop those in and expect, especially when there's virtually no public transit that makes a dent. So we're just trying to make the housing really work in a way that everybody's happy.
I see there's a question for the toolkit. Does it rely only on regulation, or did it dive into tract requirements? Good question. Example, commercial center was approved, but prohibited residential uses or only allowed certain types of uses. I think it's a question for you, David.
I mean, the toolkit only mostly relied on regulation. In terms of your example, it only did rely on regulation. So say, there was a retail commercial center that didn't approve residential, you would then look into ways of changing that through, ordinances or general plan updates, specific area plans. In terms of our, for example, retail commercial sites, the toolkit was really focused on, sites that are underutilized. Like, where does it make sense to convert retail commercial, because it is still a needed use in many areas, but do we need that much of it? Are there instances where it makes sense to repurpose the land to get a higher or greater value? So that was the approach that we took, mostly focusing on underutilized sites, whether that be retail commercial, golf courses that have limited number of players on them, or gas stations that have been vacant for a while. So the bills are SB 6 and AB 115. So they're actually also linked in the toolkit, but you could probably Google them again.
Jonathan, is your contact information available in case anyone wants to reach out for?
Yeah, I also sent it to David. So if we do any kind of follow-ups, we can provide it, but I'll put it in here for everybody. Feel free to reach out.
And so we'll be sending a link to this presentation, the recording, and we can include the link to the toolkit as well as Jonathan's contact information with that as well.
And we'd love to learn from others too. If you're working on similar things, if anyone on the call is looking at doing any kind of digital hubs or something similar, we want to talk to you. And if anyone's interested in learning a little bit more about our sustainability approach and our other REAP projects, we have one finished. That was an SB 330 supplemental form. We also have an ADU acceleration REAP project that is well underway. And we have a housing education forum that's funded by REAP. All of this is REAP 1. That is something that we'd be happy to share on. And as we all look ahead to REAP 2, if there's anything that we can share to help each other out preparing for that, we're definitely here for it.
All right. I mean, if there are no other questions, we can close the session. All right. Thank you, everyone. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you. You did a really, that's a challenging job what you had to do. I was sitting here thinking, well, I'm glad that's not me. It was really hard. You did a great job. Thank you.
Thankfully, I didn't go through our appendix. That was Jay's reading. But yeah, so we'll send it over to the toolkit. Please download it, have a look, share it with your networks. Great examples in there, links to tools that jurisdictions in the SCAG region have used. So if you need any inspiration or, to walk through how you'd go about setting a database to market potential sites to developers, we have links in the toolkit for that. So please feel free to use it as much as you can.
And David, the toolkit's going to be at the APA California conference in a session, right?
Yes. So we're going to have a session on it on Monday at the APA California conference starting at 8:45. And then we'll also be having a discussion on the toolkit at the Ventura Housing Conference on October 13th. So,
and SCAG gets a lot of credit for going ahead and investing in that. That's a really, really important analytical tool. It's really.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I appreciate you joining today.